Sarah Jenkins felt the hard, unforgiving Colorado sun on the back of her neck. It was a dry heat, the kind that baked the earth into a cracked, dusty canvas. Around her, the vast training grounds of Fort Carson stretched out, a landscape of brown hills and hardy scrub-brush, all of it sitting under the watchful eye of the Rocky Mountains. To the other soldiers in her platoon, this was just another day of drills, another day of sweat and shouted commands. To Sarah, it was a test she had to pass over and over again. Long after the official score was tallied, she tightened her grip on the rifle, the metal warm against her palms. Her squad was moving through a mock village, a collection of plywood and adobe-style buildings designed to mimic a dozen different places they might one day be sent. The air was thick with the smell of dust and the faint, metallic temps of blank ammunition. Jenkins, you're on point. Keep your eyes peeled. A gruff voice crackled over the radio in her ear. The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Mark Thorne, a man who seemed to be carved from the same rock as the mountains that loomed over them. He was a veteran of multiple tours, with a chest full of ribbons and a face that looked like it had been set in a permanent scowl. He was respected, even feared, by most of the younger soldiers. But with Sarah, there was something else in his tone. It wasn't just the hardness of a superior officer. It was a grating, dismissive edge that made her stomach clench every time she heard it. Roger that, Staff Sergeant, she replied, her voice steady and professional, betraying none of the irritation she felt. She moved forward, her movements fluid and practiced. She kept her body low, her eyes scanning every window, every doorway, every dark shadow where an ambush could be hiding. She was good at this. She knew she was. She spent her off hours studying tactics, running extra miles, and practicing at the range until her hands were raw. She had to be better than everyone else, just to be considered equal. Her father had been a command sergeant major, a legend in his time. When she'd enlisted, the old-timers at the VFW back in her small Ohio town had all patted her on the back and said, "You're gonna make your daddy proud." They meant it as a compliment, but to Sarah it felt like a weight. She wasn't just Sarah Jenkins, she was Frank Jenkins's daughter, and the shadow of his legacy was long. Thorne seemed to feel that shadow more than anyone. He'd served under her father once, a long time ago. He never spoke of it directly, but it was there in the way he looked at her, as if he was constantly comparing the tough 6'2" command sergeant major to his 5'7" daughter. As she rounded a corner, a figure popped up in a second-story window, a simulated enemy combatant. Before the role-player could even raise his weapon, Sarah had her rifle up, firing off a quick, controlled burst of 3 blank rounds. "Tango down," shouted calmly into her mic. "Took you long enough." Jenkins Thorne's voice shot back, laced with impatience. "Were you admiring the scenery?" A hot flush of anger rose in her cheeks, but she pushed it down. Arguing would get her nowhere. It would only prove his point, whatever that point was. That she was too emotional, too slow, not cut out for this. She'd heard the whispers, the quiet jokes in the barracks when they thought she wasn't listening. "Moving to the next building," she said, her voice a mask of calm. The exercise continued for another hour. Sarah performed flawlessly. She spotted 2 more hidden targets that the rest of the squad missed. She navigated a simulated minefield with textbook precision. During the after-action review, the evaluating officer, a young lieutenant, gave her high marks. "Sergeant Jenkins, your situational awareness was excellent." "Good work," Lieutenant Miller said, offering a small, encouraging smile. Sarah nodded. "Thank you, sir." But as the lieutenant moved on, she saw Thorne talking to another NCO, Sergeant Diaz. Thorne gestured dismissively in her direction, shook his head. She couldn't hear his words, but she could read his expression. She got lucky that evening. Back in the barracks, the exhaustion of the day settled into her bones. She sat on the edge of her bunk, cleaning her rifle with meticulous care, the familiar scent of solvent filling the air. Most of the other soldiers were laughing, playing cards, or staring at their phones. She felt a familiar sense of isolation, a wall between her and them that was built not of her own making, but of Thorne's constant, subtle campaign against her. Her bunkmate, a young private named Miller, no relation to the lieutenant, hesitantly approached her. He was fresh out of basic, barely 19, and still had the wide-eyed look of someone who couldn't believe he was really here. "You were awesome out there today, Sergeant," he said quietly, his voice full of genuine admiration. "I've never seen anyone spot targets that fast." Sarah offered him a small, tired smile. "Thanks, Miller. Just keep your head on a swivel. You'll get the hang of it. It's just, Staff Sergeant Thorne is always so hard on you," Miller continued, lowering his voice even more. You do everything right, and he still finds something to complain about. He's hard on everyone, Miller, she said, though they both knew that wasn't entirely true. He's trying to make us better, to keep us alive. It was the company line, the excuse she gave herself and anyone else who asked. It was easier than admitting the truth, that her superior officer just plain didn't like her, and he was letting it cloud his judgment. I guess, Miller mumbled, unconvinced. Later, that night, as she lay in her bunk, staring up at the metal springs of the bed above her, Sarah let the frustration wash over her. She had followed all the rules, she had worked twice as hard. She had proven her competence time and time again. Yet she was still on the outside looking in, treated like a liability, a token. The daughter who was trying to play in her father's league. A week later, the entire company was called for a surprise formation in the pre-dawn chill. The air was cold and thin, and the soldiers stood in neat rows, their breath pluming in front of them. The company commander stood before them, his face serious. "All right, listen up," he began, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "Our deployment timeline has been moved up. We've received our orders. We're shipping out in 2 weeks." A low murmur rippled through the formation. "Where are we going, sir?" someone called out. The commander's eyes swept over them. "Afghanistan, a remote valley in the Kunar province. We'll be taking over a small observation post, Op Valley Forge. It's a tough assignment, isolated. We need to be at our absolute best." Sarah's heart began to pound, a mixture of fear and, to her surprise, a surge of fierce determination. This was it. This was the real thing. No more simulations, no more blank rounds. This was where it all mattered. Her gaze drifted and found Staff Sergeant Thorne. He was already looking at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light, but she could feel it, the weight of his disapproval, the challenge in his eyes. In the desolate mountains of Afghanistan, there would be no room for error. There would be no room for luck. There would only be the truth of what a soldier was made of, and Sarah Jenkins was determined, more than ever, to show him, and the world, who she really was. The thought was both terrifying and liberating, and her chance was coming. She just had to survive it. The C-17 transport plane felt like a rattling metal tube, hurtling them through the darkness. For hours the only sound was the deafening drone of the engines, a constant, mind-numbing roar that made conversation impossible. Sarah sat strapped into her seat, her rifle held between her knees, watching the other soldiers. Some slept, their heads lolling against the fuselage. Others stared blankly into space, their faces a mixture of bravado and barely concealed fear. She saw Staff Sergeant Thorne a few rows ahead, talking with Sergeant Diaz. Even from a distance, she could see his emphatic gestures, the hard set of his jaw. He was in his element, a man built for the stark certainties of war. Sarah felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach, but she pushed it down, replacing it with a cold, focused calm. This was the job. This was what she had trained for. They landed at Bagram Airfield, a sprawling, chaotic city of dust and machinery. The air hit them like a physical blow-thin, dry, and smelling of diesel fumes and strange spices. From there, it was a series of helicopter flights, each one taking them deeper into the rugged, unforgiving landscape of eastern Afghanistan. The mountains were like jagged teeth, biting at the sky, vast and indifferent. It was a place that made you feel small, insignificant. Their final destination, Op Valley Forge, was little more than a handful of sand-filled barriers and plywood huts perched on a desolate ridge. It overlooked a long, narrow valley, a patchwork of small villages and terraced fields that looked deceptively peaceful from above. But the briefings had been clear. This valley was a known transit route for insurgents. The peace was an illusion. The platoon they were replacing looked exhausted. The men were gaunt, their eyes hollow, their movements weary. They shared information in clipped, tired tones, pointing out landmarks, known enemy positions, and the routines of the locals. "Watch the high ground to the north," a grizzled sergeant told Thorne, his voice rasping. "They like to take potshots from up there, especially in the late afternoon, and be careful with the village elders. Some are friendly, some are playing both sides." Sarah was assigned to the command post, a cramped, sandbagged bunker that housed the radio equipment. It was her specialty, communications. She was responsible for maintaining the intricate web of signals that connected their tiny, isolated outpost to the outside world, to battalion headquarters, to air support, to their lifeline. The bunker was dark and smelled of stale coffee and ozone. She set to work immediately, checking the connections, testing the frequencies, and organizing the equipment. It was a mess. The outgoing unit had let things slide. Wires were tangled, Logs were incomplete, and the backup generator was sputtering. Thorn stuck his head in a few hours after they arrived. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on the tangle of wires she was patiently sorting through. "What's the status on the comms, Jenkins?" he asked, his tone already accusatory. "The primary satellite link is secure, Staff Sergeant," she reported, not looking up from her work. "The backup high-frequency radio needs maintenance, and the wiring in here is a fire hazard. I'm sorting it out. Just make sure it works," he grunted. "We're deaf and dumb without you. Don't mess it up." He disappeared before she could reply. Don't mess it up. The word stung. It wasn't an expression of trust in her skills. It was a warning, a preemptive accusation. He expected her to fail. The days at OP Valley Forge fell into a tense, monotonous rhythm. The sun would rise, baking the ridge in a relentless heat. The soldiers would stand their watches, patrol the perimeter, and clean their weapons. The afternoons were often punctuated by the distant, crackling sound of gunfire, a reminder that they were not alone. The nights were cold and filled with a profound, unnerving silence. Sarah worked tirelessly in the comms bunker. She rewired the entire system, labeled every connection, and got the backup generator running smoothly. She created redundant systems, ensuring that if one radio went down, another could be brought online in seconds. It was her small kingdom, a place where competence was measured in clear signals and reliable connections, but her expertise did little to change Thorn's attitude. He seemed to view her technical skills as some kind of lesser non-contribution. He would mock her, calling the bunker Sarah's beauty parlor, or asking if she needed help with all the pretty colored wires. One afternoon, a patrol squad got pinned down by sniper fire from the northern ridge. The squad leader's voice was frantic over the radio, the sound of bullets pinging off rock audible in the background. "We're taking effective fire from grid coordinate 4-7. We can't identify the shooter's exact position." The command bunker was a flurry of activity. The lieutenant was trying to coordinate a response, but the sniper's position was too high and too well hidden for them to risk sending another team out. "We need eyes in the sky," the lieutenant said. "Get me a drone feed," Thorn scoffed. "By the time we get a drone redirected here, my guys could be dead. We need to lay down suppressing fire." "At what, Staff Sergeant?" the lieutenant shot back, his frustration showing. "The whole damn mountain." Sarah was listening intently, not just to the voices, but to the sounds. She put on a pair of high-quality headphones, filtering out the noise in the bunker and focusing on the transmission from the pinned-down squad. The sniper was using a Russian Dragunov rifle. She recognized the distinctive, sharp crack of the weapon. But there was another sound, a faint, rhythmic echo. She ran the transmission through a sound editing program on her computer, isolating and amplifying the background noise. The echo was clearer now. "It wasn't random, sir," she said, turning to the lieutenant. "The echo from the sniper's rifle is bouncing off a large, flat rock face. Based on the delay about half a second and the direction the squad is facing, the shooter isn't on the main ridge. He's lower, in that outcropping of caves we mapped yesterday." She pointed to a spot on the large digital map on the wall. Here the lieutenant stared at the map, then at her. Thorn looked at her with open disbelief. "You got that from an echo?" Thorn sneered. "Are your ears magic now, Jenkins?" "It's physics, Staff Sergeant," she replied coolly. "Sound travels at a predictable speed. The delay tells you the distance." The lieutenant didn't hesitate. He trusted the science more than Thorn's skepticism. "Mortar team, you have the coordinates. Fire for effect." 2 minutes later, 2 mortar rounds screamed out of the base, landing with a pair of dull thuds on the mountainside. The sniper fire stopped. The radio crackled to life again, the squad leader's voice filled with relief. "Target neutralized. Good hit, good hit. How did you guys know where he was?" In the bunker, the lieutenant gave Sarah a look of profound gratitude. "Good work, Sergeant. You just saved their lives." Thorn said nothing. He just stared at the map, his jaw tight. He walked out of the bunker without another word. Sarah expected to feel a sense of triumph, a moment of vindication. Instead, she just felt a weary emptiness. She had done her job. She had saved lives. And the one person whose respect she felt she needed to earn now seemed to hate her more than ever. Later that week, Thorn put her on perimeter guard duty, a rotation usually reserved for the infantry privates. It was a clear punishment, a way of reminding her that her place was not in the command bunker, not offering tactical advice, but out here, standing in the dust. She stood her watch, staring out at the valley as dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the villages below. It was a beautiful, dangerous place. She knew Thorn was trying to break her, to push her until she quit or made a mistake he could use against her. He didn't understand. The hardship didn't weaken her. It forged her. The injustice didn't break her spirit. It tempered it into something harder, like steel. She wasn't her father's daughter, trying to live up to his name. She was Sergeant Sarah Jenkins, and she was going to survive this valley, and him. As darkness fell, she heard a faint noise on the wind. It wasn't the wind itself. It was something else. A low, rhythmic sound. Like chanting. It seemed to be coming from one of the villages, but it sounded closer. A cold feeling prickled the back of her neck. Something was wrong. The valley was whispering, and it wasn't saying anything good. The low rhythmic chanting that Sarah had heard on the wind grew louder over the next hour. It was an unsettling sound, a human noise in a landscape that was usually defined by the whisper of the wind and the cry of distant birds. It wasn't a call to prayer. It was something else, something more ominous. It felt like a gathering storm. She reported it over her radio, her voice calm and precise, describing the sound and its apparent direction. It's probably just a local wedding or a funeral, Jenkins, came the bored reply from the soldier monitoring the radio in the command bunker. Don't get your panties in a twist. Sarah gritted her teeth. It doesn't sound like a celebration, she insisted. It sounds organized, and it's getting closer. She could feel the vibrations through the soles of her boots now, a low thrumming in the earth. The moon was a pale sliver, offering little light. The valley below was a pit of darkness, but the darkness seemed to be alive, moving. Suddenly, a green flare shot up from the valley floor, bursting high above the observation post. It hung in the air for a moment, casting an eerie, sickly light over the entire ridge, and in that light she saw them. They weren't in the distant villages. They were at the base of the ridge, swarming out of the darkness. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. They were moving with a terrifying speed and purpose, a wave of armed men pouring up the slopes toward the outpost. Contact, she screamed into her radio, all pretense of calm gone. Contact front. We have a massive force moving on our position. They're at the wire. The air exploded. The night was torn apart by the roar of RPGs and the deafening chatter of machine gun. Fire and explosion rocked the ground near her guard post, throwing her against the sandbag wall. Her ears rang, and the air was thick with dust and the smell of explosives. The entire outpost erupted into a chaotic symphony of violence. Alarms blared, soldiers scrambled to their positions, their shouts swallowed by the noise of the battle. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness in every direction. The attack wasn't a probe or a potshot from the ridge. It was a full-scale, coordinated assault designed to overwhelm and destroy them. Sarah scrambled back from the crumbling edge of her post, firing her rifle into the advancing shadows. She saw figures breaching the outer perimeter wire, their movements quick and agile in the strobing light of the battle. Fall back to the command bunker. A voice yelled. It was Lieutenant Miller. Everyone fall back to the main compound. She ran, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. Bullets zipped past her, kicking up spurts of dust at her feet. She dove into the relative safety of the main trench line just as a mortar round landed exactly where she had been standing moments before. The command bunker was chaos. The lieutenant was yelling orders, trying to direct the defense. Medics were already working on the first casualties. And in the center of it all was Staff Sergeant Thorn, his face a mask of fury, screaming into a radio handset. I need air support. We are being overrun. Where is my air support? He roared. Sarah pushed her way to the station. The main radio was dead. A piece of shrapnel from an RPG blast had torn through the wall and smashed the primary transceiver. Sparks were still spitting from the ruined device. The main radio was down. She yelled over the din. Thorn whirled on her, his eyes wild. Well, fix it. That's your job, isn't it? It's destroyed. Staff Sergeant. It's gone, she yelled back, pointing at the smoking wreck. I'm switching to the backup HF radio. She threw herself into the chair, her hands flying across the control panel of the secondary system. She flipped the power switch. Nothing. She tried again. The power indicator light flickered once, then died. The generator must have taken a hit, she said, her voice tight with rising panic. There's no power to the backup. No power. Thorn's face was inches from hers, his voice a low, dangerous growl. You told me you fixed that generator. You told me you had redundant systems. The generator is outside the bunker, she shot back, her fear momentarily replaced by a surge of anger. It's not shielded. I told you it needed to be moved, but you said it wasn't a priority. It was true. She had filed a report a week ago, pointing out the vulnerability of the backup power supply. Thorne had dismissed it as her being overly cautious. Just keep the batteries charged. Jenkins, he had said. It'll be fine. It wasn't fine. They were cut off. The radio was silent. The sounds of the battle outside were getting closer, more intense. The steady thud of their own heavy machine gun was faltering, replaced by the higher-pitched chatter of enemy weapons. They were losing the firefight. They were losing the perimeter. We're blind, the lieutenant said, his face pale. No comms, no support, we're on our own. Thorne looked like a man cornered. The bravado and arrogance were gone, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. He looked at Sarah, and his eyes were filled with a terrible, misplaced blame. It was her fault in his mind. It had to be her fault. This is on you, Jenkins, he snarled. You and your fancy gear. You were so confident, so smart. Look where it got us. Before Sarah could even process the injustice of his words, a massive explosion shook the entire bunker, sending a shower of dust and debris down from the ceiling. A runner stumbled in, his face covered in blood. They've breached the western wall, he gasped. They're inside the compound. This was it. The moment every soldier fears. Their position was being overrun. There would be no retreat, no surrender. The enemy pouring through the walls were not there to take prisoners. Sarah's mind raced, shutting out Thorne's accusations, shutting out the fear. She thought about her training, about the systems she knew like the back of her hand. There had to be a way. There had to be something. And then she remembered. The LRAS-3, the long-range advanced scout surveillance system. It was a powerful piece of targeting equipment, essentially a high-tech set of binoculars with a laser rangefinder and, most importantly, a satellite uplink for transmitting target data. It had its own independent, short-life battery pack. It wasn't designed for voice communication, but it sent out a digital signal, a data burst. If she could get it working, if she could power it up and point it at the sky, someone at headquarters might see the signal. It wasn't a voice asking for help, but it was a sign of life. A digital pulse from a dying outpost. The problem was, the LRAS-3 wasn't in the bunker. It was mounted in the observation tower, the highest and most exposed point in the entire outpost. The tower was currently being riddled with machine gun fire. Getting to it would be a suicide run. She looked at the faces around her, the young lieutenant, trying to rally his men for a last stand, the terrified medic, pressing his hands against a grievous wound, and Thorne, his authority crumbling, his face a mask of disbelief that this could be happening to him. There was no choice. Standing here meant dying. Making a run for the tower that also probably meant dying. But it was a chance. It was the only chance they had. She grabbed a spare bag of medical supplies and a small toolkit. She looked at the lieutenant. Sir, there's one last thing I can try, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. But I have to get to the observation tower. The lieutenant looked at her, then at the chaos outside. He knew what she was asking. He gave a single, grim nod. Godspeed, Sergeant. Sarah didn't look at Thorne. She couldn't. She scrambled out of the bunker and into the nightmare. The air was a thick, choking soup of smoke and cordite. The compound was a hellscape of fire and shadows. The enemy was everywhere. She kept her head down and ran. She ran towards the tower, the single, desperate hope in a world that had fallen completely silent. The world outside the command bunker was a blur of fire and motion. Sarah ran low, her body screaming with a primal fear she had never known. The air was alive with the sound of things breaking, the crack of bullets passing her ear, the whine of ricochets off metal and rock, the roar of explosions that felt like punches to the chest. The main compound of Op Valley Forge had become a killing ground. She could see the observation tower, a skeletal silhouette against the fiery, chaotic sky. It was maybe 50 yards away, but it felt like miles. Between her and the tower, the fighting was thick and desperate. She saw soldiers from her platoon taking cover behind burning sandbags, returning fire in short, disciplined bursts. She saw the enemy, dark figures moving with a terrifying speed, overwhelming the defenses through sheer numbers. There was no clear path. She would have to cross open ground, a stretch of earth that was being chewed to pieces by machine gun fire. She took a deep breath, the smoke searing her lungs, and she ran. She zigzagged, just as she'd been taught, making herself an unpredictable target. Dust kicked up around her feet. She heard her shout her name. She thought, but it was swallowed by the din. She didn't look back. Looking back was death. A searing pain shot through her left arm. She stumbled, falling hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. She looked down. Blood was soaking through her sleeve, a dark, spreading stain. She'd been hit. The pain was sharp, but the adrenaline was sharper. It was a through and through. It hurt, but it wouldn't stop her. She pushed herself up, grabbing the toolkit and medbag, and kept moving. She reached the base of the tower, a simple steel ladder leading up to the small, enclosed platform at the top. The tower itself was shaking, vibrating with the impact of countless bullets. It was like climbing a tuning fork in the middle of an earthquake. She slung her rifle over her back and started to climb. Her wounded arm screamed in protest, her grip slick with her own blood. Each rung was an agony. Halfway up, a volley of fire raked the structure just below her, and the whole tower swayed violently. She clung on, her knuckles white, her teeth gritted so hard her jaw ached. She looked down and saw the battle raging below, a scene of pure, unadulterated hell. She forced herself to look up and keep climbing. She finally hauled herself onto the platform. The small space was a wreck. The windows were shattered, and the wind howled through the gaps. The LRAS-3 unit was there, mounted on its tripod, but it was damaged. The main casing was cracked, and a spray of shrapnel had torn into the side panel. Heart sank. If the internal electronics were damaged, this was all for nothing. She ignored the pain in her arm and the chaos outside and went to work. Her fingers, clumsy with cold and fear, fumbled with the toolkit. She pried open the damaged panel. Inside was a delicate web of circuit boards and wires. She saw the problem immediately. The impact had knocked the main power connector loose. From the internal battery, it was a simple fix, in theory, but the connector was bent and the space was tight. Outside, the battle was reaching its crescendo. The sounds of American weapons were dwindling, being replaced by the triumphant shouts of the attackers. They were running out of time. Come on, she whispered to herself, her voice a ragged prayer. She used a pair of needle-nosed pliers to carefully straighten the delicate metal pins of the connector. Her hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from blood loss and sheer terror. A stray bullet punched through the wall of the platform, missing her head by inches. She didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. She guided the connector back into its socket. It resisted. She pushed harder, her vision starting to blur at the edges. With a final, desperate shove, it clicked into place. A small green light on the control panel flickered to life. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees washed over her. It had power now for the hard part. She swung the heavy unit around, pointing its lens up, away from the battle, towards the empty, dark sky. She powered on the system, her fingers flying across the keypad, entering the commands she knew by heart. She bypassed the standard targeting functions and went straight for the communication protocol. She initiated the emergency a repeated, high-intensity signal that would, with any luck, be picked up by a satellite and flagged at battalion headquarters. It wasn't a call for help. It was just a digital blip. A hello from a place that was supposed to be dead. The system word to life. On the small screen, a progress bar appeared, transmitting she had done it. Maybe now she just had to stay alive long enough for it to matter. She crawled to the edge of the platform and looked down. The situation was worse than she could have imagined. The enemy was inside the final defensive perimeter. The command bunker was under direct assault. She saw a group of attackers planting a charge on the bunker's main door. They were going to blow their way in. Her rifle was on her back. Her duty was to her fellow soldiers. She couldn't just sit up here and wait. She ripped a piece of fabric from her uniform and quickly tied a crude tourniquet around her wounded arm to slow the bleeding. Then she positioned herself at one of the shattered windows. Using the damaged wall for cover, she took a deep breath, centered the front sight post on the first target she saw, and began to fire. Her shots were measured, controlled, one by one. She wasn't spraying and praying. She was making every bullet count. A figure carrying an RPG went down. Another setting up a machine gun slumped over his weapon. Her intervention, coming from an unexpected, elevated position, created a moment of confusion among the attackers. They had assumed the tower was empty, neutralized. Now they were taking effective fire from it. Down below, inside the command bunker, the remaining soldiers heard it. The familiar sound of a single M4, firing with a steady, disciplined rhythm from above. It's Jenkins, Lieutenant Miller said, his voice filled with disbelief and awe. She's in the tower. She's drawing their fire. Staff Sergeant Thorne looked up at the ceiling, his face a complex mixture of shock and something else, something he couldn't name. He had sent her out there with his words of blame and contempt. He had written her off as dead. But she wasn't dead. She was fighting. For them, the distraction Sarah created was just enough. It bought the defenders in the bunker a few precious seconds to brace for the explosion at their door. Up in the tower, Sarah knew she was a target now. The full fury of the enemy attack began to focus on her position. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the platform. The structure groaned and shuddered. She kept firing until her magazine ran dry. As she reached for a fresh one, a rock grenade slammed into the base of the tower. The world tilted violently. Metal screamed as it twisted and tore. The platform gave way, and Sarah Jenkins, along with the machine that held their only hope, plunged into the darkness below. Her last conscious thought was of the small green light on the control panel. The light that meant, against all odds, that the radio was no longer silent. The fall was a chaotic jumble of twisting metal and shattering impacts. Sarah's world dissolved into a brief, violent symphony of pain, and then, nothing. Darkness. Silence. She awoke to a sound. It wasn't the crack of rifles or the roar of explosions. It was a noise unlike any other, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the air. It was a deep, guttural growl that grew into a monstrous, shrieking roar. It was the sound of vengeance. She opened her eyes. The sky above was no longer black, but streaked with dawn. She was lying in the wreckage of the observation tower, her body a canvas of agony. But the pain was distant, secondary to the spectacle unfolding above her. An A-10, Thunderbolt II, the jet affectionately known as the Warthog, was banking hard over the valley. It was ugly and beautiful all at once, a machine built for one purpose: to protect the soldiers on the ground. Its twin engines screamed as it lined up for a pass, its straight wings and armored cockpit making it look like a prehistoric bird of prey. The attackers, who had been moments from their final victory, now scattered in terror. They fired their rifles and machine guns at the jet, their bullets bouncing harmlessly off its titanium armor. The A-10 ignored them, its pilot focused, its mission clear. Then came the sound that every soldier on the ground prays to hear, and every enemy dreads: the BRRRT. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon on the nose of the plane opened up. It wasn't so much a series of gunshots as it was a single, continuous, terrifying noise, like the sky itself was being ripped in half. A stream of 30mm rounds, each the size of a milk bottle, slammed into the ground where the main enemy force was concentrated. The earth erupted. The force of the impacts was biblical, a line of fire and destruction that vaporized everything it touched. The A-10 pulled up, its engines roaring, and circled back for another run. This time it released a volley of rockets that slammed into the enemy's heavy weapon positions on the ridge, silencing them in a series of brilliant orange fireballs. Down in the ruins of Op Valley Forge, the surviving American soldiers, who had been preparing to die, watched in stunned, tearful silence. It was a miracle. It was salvation delivered from the sky. Sarah tried to push herself up, but a fresh wave of pain from her leg, which was pinned beneath a steel girder, sent her crashing back down. She could only lie there and watch as the A-10 dismantled the attacking force, its passes relentless, its destruction precise and overwhelming. When it was over, a profound silence fell over the valley, broken only by the crackle of fires and the distant, fading roar of the jet. Help arrived. Soon after, Black Hawk helicopters descended like guardian angels, dropping off medics and reinforcements. The wounded were quickly triaged and evacuated. Sarah was carefully extracted from the wreckage, her leg badly broken, her body bruised and battered, but she was alive. As they carried her on a stretcher towards a waiting helicopter, she passed what was left of the command bunker. Lieutenant Miller rushed over, his face streaked with grime and tears. "You did it, Jenkins," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We saw the signal. They didn't believe it at first. They thought it was a glitch, but it stayed on. A constant, steady pulse. They sent the Warthog to investigate." He shook his head in awe. "You saved us all." Behind him, Staff Sergeant Thorne stood awkwardly. His face was a wreck of conflicting emotions: relief, exhaustion, and a deep, gut-wrenching shame. He looked at Sarah, at her pale face and broken body on the stretcher. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just looked at her, and for the first time, she saw him not as a monster of prejudice, but as a flawed, frightened man who had been confronted with the undeniable truth of his own error. He had been wrong about her, wrong about the generator, wrong about everything, and his wrongness had almost cost them all their lives. Her rightness, her stubborn, insulted, underestimated competence, had been their only salvation. The after-action report was a brutal, honest affair. The wrecked LRAS-3 unit was recovered, its logs confirming it had transmitted the emergency signal. Sarah's own report about the vulnerable generator, which Thorne had dismissed, was entered into the official record. The young private, Miller, and several other soldiers gave testimony about Thorne's constant belittling of Sarah and his panicked, blame-filled reaction when the comms went down. Thorne was quietly and unceremoniously relieved of his command. His career was over. There was no court-martial, no public disgrace. He was simply faded out, a relic of an old way of thinking, broken not by the enemy, but by his own pride. It wasn't revenge. It was justice, cold and impartial. Months later, Sarah was back in the United States, at a military hospital undergoing physical therapy. Her leg was healing, and the scars on her arm were a permanent reminder of that night. She had been awarded the Silver Star for her The citation spoke of her unwavering courage under fire and technical ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. One afternoon, she had a visitor, a female Air Force captain with pilot's wings on her chest, Sergeant Jenkins. "I'm Captain Eva Rostova," the woman said, extending a hand. "I was hoping I could talk to you." Sarah shook her hand. "Ma'am, I was the pilot of the A-10 that night," Captain Rostova said, a small wry smile on her face. "I wanted to meet the person who sent up that ghost signal. We call them that, you know, signals from a position that's been declared lost. Most of the time, they're just equipment malfunctions." "I'm glad it wasn't," Sarah said quietly. "Me too," the captain replied. "When we saw that signal, solid and steady, coming from a position that was supposedly overrun, we knew someone was still down there, fighting like hell." She looked at Sarah with a deep, professional respect. "You didn't just call for help, Sergeant. Your signal told us exactly where you were. It gave us a perfect target to protect. You did our job and your job that night." They talked for an hour, two warriors from different branches, sharing a bond forged in fire over a forgotten valley. When Sarah was finally released from the hospital, she returned to her small Ohio town. This time, when the old-timers at the VFW saw her, they didn't talk about her father. They stood up. They looked at the silver star pinned to her uniform. They looked at her. "Welcome home, Sergeant," one of them said, his voice thick with a respect that was new and total. She was no longer living in her father's shadow. She had cast her own. It was a shadow born of injustice, forged in fire, and earned with a courage that had refused to be silenced. In the quiet of her own home, she finally felt at peace. The radio was no longer silent, and neither was she.